Hello and welcome, Andrew Collins. This is such a great opportunity, a great moment for me to have you on.
Thank you.
I've seen you on especially where many people might have heard about you is on the Ancient Aliens show and those kinds of shows, which have their interesting sides, and they have also perhaps some other things that are a bit out there, yeah. But the important thing about those types of shows for me is how they present these new views about the ancient human past. Um, it's probably hard nowadays or today to confirm or deny the possibility of um, extra human interference or help perhaps in our ancient past, but the fact that new discoveries are coming up so often, right? About old structures and stuff like that. That's a very interesting thing. So yeah, thank you very much for being here. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for inviting me on to this show.
Mm. So please, if you will, let's start by you sharing a little bit about your own story, yeah, and perhaps we could then segue into some of the ancient past stuff or some of the supernatural stuff or whatever comes up, yeah.
Yeah, my own story begins in my teens, my early teens, when I was interested in more material things like aircraft and trains and just stupid things really. And I saw something strange in the sky that went over one night, and I couldn't fit it into the paradigm that I, was working within at that time. And I assumed it was some kind of UFO. I mean, in retrospect now, it's probably just a fireball or something. But um, it set off a chain of thinking, and that is, what are these things called UFOs? And so I started to read a whole lot of books by people like John Keel, Jacques Vallée, Brinsley Lipper Trench, Raymond Drake, etc., etc. And they led me into trying to want to get closer to the intelligence behind this phenomena, which I took to be real right from the word go. And I wondered how I might do this. And so I joined a national UFO organization called Bufora, and they made me a local investigator. So I was going to, I was going out from that point onwards, interviewing people that had seen strange things in the sky. Now, as we know, 9 out of 10 of these can be explained away as mundane objects or as planets or misidentifications of one sort or another. But that that 1 out of 10 was the one that obviously everybody was interested in. And I started to interview people that had been much closer to this phenomena, whether it be small balls of light or much larger exotic objects. And I started to realize that I was seeing it all wrong, that to look at these objects as in some way nuts and bolts, in other words, no different to a Boeing 747 crossing the sky, was wrong. There was something else going on here, because the witnesses to close encounters, and I want to say close, I don't mean, seeing occupants necessarily. I mean, that came later. I mean, just connecting and interacting with the phenomena at sea. There seemed to be a psychic element, one that you couldn't escape from. And at first, I thought maybe these people are just mad. I mean, they didn't see anything. They're just making it up. But after a little while, I realized, no, that's not right. These are quite genuine people. Yes, they're odd in the fact that they've also had other types of experience as well. That they may have seen a ghost, they may feel presences, they may actually project, but they are essentially genuine in what they say and what they see. And so I started to realize that there was a hidden element to what we call the UFO phenomenon. And I wanted to get closer and closer to it. And eventually I investigated the first ever car stop abduction case in the UK, which, although it took place in 1974, was not reported until 1977. And it was a whole family that had been going along in a car. They'd seen this strange object above them. It had disappeared, but they went round a corner. The car headlights failed, the car engine failed, etc., etc. And they found themselves going into this mist, which was illuminated. In other words, it had light within it. They went within this and suddenly found themselves 3/4 of a mile, about a kilometre or so further on from where they were. And subsequent hypnosis revealed that, they'd been aboard a spacecraft and etc., etc. That side was quite conventional, but it was clear that something more was going on here, because afterwards, particularly the man of the house, John Day, felt that he had a connection with the intelligence behind what he saw, and that he could communicate with this intelligence either through dreams, where he'd find himself astrally projecting and going out into what he considered to be almost like the center of the universe somewhere, and connecting with in mind with these other intelligences. His wife also experienced this, but to a lesser degree and on a slightly more varied level. But, so suddenly I found myself linking with the intelligences that were behind this phenomenon. So, of course, what do you ask? I mean, and I mean, quite clearly, you start asking, well, who are you? Where are you from? And where, can I see one of your flying machines or something? But again, that doesn't quite work, because once more you start realizing that you are linking with something that is beyond normal comprehension in our 3D reality in which we live. So the answers seem to be, quite technical, and I think in many ways they were reflective of the mind of the witness, John Day, and obviously his wife, who was coming up with stuff. But I started to see so many strange things when I was with this family, everything from entities to seeing things flying through the air, flashes like lights, to poltergeist phenomena, to me having my first astral projection experience whilst I was with the family, staying there one night. That it started changing everything. As a person, I started changing. They were changing after their experience, but I now became a vegetarian. I became quite ecologically minded. I started to take an interest in things like stone circles, prehistoric sites of all kinds, and wanting to connect with them, going to places like Stonehenge, Avebury, Glastonbury, and feeling there was a link between the phenomena and the peoples of the past that had created these monuments, that had in some way interacted with the same type of consciousness, intelligence, beings that existed to them just as they are to us. And even though we are seeing them in terms of space technology, alien hardware, etc., that this was something that was ages old, something that had been with us not just since, let's say, Neolithic times, but probably since the beginning of humanity. And these were ideas that were going in my head. I couldn't prove them. I couldn't even provide evidence to support these ideas, but they stuck with me. And some of these ideas have come out in books that I've written, like Light Quest, which came out in 2012, Alien Energy, which came out in 1994, The Circle Makers, that came out in 1992. And I'm doing a book with my colleague Greg Little right now, which is currently untitled, but it will try and look at everything I've just said here and use absolute evidence of archaeology and personal experience and science, right the way down to quantum physics, to try and show everything that I've just said. And that is that we have been in connection with some kind of other consciousness since the very beginning. I mean, in the 1950s, you had people like Carl Jung writing about what are flying saucers. And although a lot of people come out of reading his, book of that title, thinking that his conclusion was that these things are all in our head and that they're just like some kind of archetypal phenomena that is, no different to seeing the Virgin Mary or, worshipping Christ or whatever. But he didn't say that. What he said was that it was an objective phenomena and that our minds interact with it to make it appear as we want it to appear through the concept of archetypes. And once you start realizing this and you realize that other people are coming up with similar ideas like John Keel, Jacques Vallée, Michael Persinger, the Canadian neurochemist, and who did a lot on the relationship between the phenomena and the human mind. So we tried to put all of this together, and as bizarre as it seems, the book actually, and I mean, I should be promoting the book that's actually out, which you've got in your hand, but what we are going to be showing is that the beginning of shamanism, as much as 400,000 years ago, is all part of this bigger story, coming all the way through to the Denisovans, which is the subject of the book, which we're perhaps supposed to be talking about, called Denisovan Origins, which I also co-wrote with Greg Little. And that we're pulling all of this together. And I'd like to think that I'm getting near to a comprehensive answer to everything. I mean, quite clearly, I've only got half a book and he's only got half a book. So, you can't write, the origins of the species or something like that, but the sort of Darwinian classic of multi-volumes or whatever. But the right ideas, I think, are coming together. And what we are doing in many ways is creating what is the real ancient aliens. And when you look at the works of people like Eric von Daniken, who I have much respect for, I know him as a friend, or people like Zachariah Sitchin, their immediate vision of ancient aliens coming down in rockets and spaceships and things like that, I think is flawed in the sense that you're not looking deep enough for answers here. I don't think that you can just look at some rock art and say, oh, look, that's a rocket ship there. Or look at that figure there, he's obviously wearing a spacesuit. I just don't think it works that way. I'm not saying that we have never been visited by nuts and bolts spacecraft, flesh and blood alien beings, not whatsoever. But what I think is that for us to try and answer these questions simply by looking at the technology that we've had over the last 70 years is, I think, quite naive, and we should be looking much further beyond that. And the work that I'm doing with Ancient Aliens now is taking us into that realm. I mean, quite clearly, some of the episodes are about, space and about nuts and bolts craft and cover-ups and, that side of it, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But the side that I'm working with is the consciousness connection. And I know people like Graham Hancock, another friend and colleague of mine, also feels and thinks the same way about what is going on. That that's what we really want to try and get to the bottom of right now.
Yeah, that first of all, wow, the story that you were telling about working with this family and how just by being in contact with them, something got into you, let's say, and woke something up inside of you that took you on this path that's been for several years, which is an amazing origin story actually. And something that's coming up for me on the stuff that you're saying now is how, even though we might still be learning, or we might have been going in steps in our understanding of all this phenomena, first thinking of only nuts and bolts crafts perhaps and stuff like that, we are slowly evolving into an understanding of how it all, like you were saying, it's connected all to consciousness. How even the origin of humanity, the ancient megalithic sites, the contact with extra human entities or consciousnesses perhaps, and even as you mentioned, shamanism, how it all seems to be so connected to the essence of who we are actually, and how we were helped by who knows what we could call this thing, because in a way it seems as something that is different from us, but in another way, when you look at it a bit deeper, it seems to be part of us too, or we seem to be part of it, or there is something that is common to both aspects of this story.
Absolutely. And I think that the key is what I refer to as human consciousness interaction. And what I mean by this is that, you know, the way that we think affects things. This can be shown on a quantum level with both the idea of the observer effect or the observer principle, where if you observe a experiment taking place that involves some atomic particles, it will affect the outcome than if you were if you were doing that same experiment and nobody was looking at it. So, you know, they call it the observer principle, the observer effect. And what this tells us is that this is not just a case of looking. This is not just a case of our eyes catching what's going on. It's a case of human consciousness interaction with the experiment changes what's going on. Now, this may only be, you know, a few electrons doing something slightly different. So it's on such a subtle level that it's not going to affect our 3D reality in which we live. But that's so important, because if you then multiply that to the fact that there are conscious beings covering the planet, and we don't even know whether we should be involving every animal and every tree and every plant as well, probably we should to some degree, that all of this is affecting the physical existence of the universe on a subatomic level. And this isn't something that is you know, is just a matter of moving around a few particles, because quite clearly, if you knock particles out from an atom, it changes them into ions. And ionization is something that's crucially important, I think, to understanding our interaction with this phenomena, because ionization is one of the key focuses of what we refer to as plasma. And plasma environments are created by extremely energetic reactions and their effects upon atoms and molecules. And what they do is create environments of free electrons and ions that expand outwards with self-generated magnetic fields, which also release tiny photons of light that suddenly you can see. And, you know, these objects become the basis of what we would call UFOs. I mean, very clearly they're connected with ball lightning as well, which is something that's associated with, you know, the production of streak lightning, but also they're connected with earthquakes and so-called earthquake lights. And they can be manufactured within the earth through various processes to do with the stresses and strains on certain types of minerals, most obviously quartz, which, when it's deformed, releases electrons. The electrons flow, create an electrical flow, and if there is enough of a reaction, you know, these can, you know, exit the earth itself, start mixing with air particles, and bang, suddenly you've got this huge object appearing of light, which is able to sustain itself for anything from a microsecond, which means you would only see it as like a flash of a camera, or it could be sustained for seconds, minutes, and in some rare instances for hours. And if you think that almost every UFO encounter and many encounters with so-called occupants or entities start with light or flashes of light, then you start to realize that if this is plasma, this is the key to understanding our interaction with this phenomena. So what is this phenomena? Well, you know, what I've tried to say in past books, and I'm trying to say in the next book, is that, you know, we're dealing with something that's not simply three-dimensional here. You're dealing with something that's four-dimensional and above. You know, it could be multi-dimensional in the sense that you're dealing with, you know, hundreds, thousands of different dimensions. We don't know, but somehow it allows us to connect with a much deeper level of existence, which science today is referring to as the quantum field. And it's a very similar concept to what scientists of the 19th century referred to as the ether. And it's basically a, you know, a universal field out of which everything else is able to manifest, you know, everything from the Higgs boson up to physical matter. And, you know, this is there. I mean, and you, once you start putting all these two pieces together, you start to realize that when people see UFOs, when people encounter these entities, you could, you know, that there is a scientific basis for it all. But beyond that is that you are dealing with consciousness, intelligences, beings that are outside of three-dimensional reality, and because of which we can't perceive them properly at all. You know, I mean, the old analogy is, you know, if we were as three-dimensional creatures to enter a two-dimensional world, the two-dimensional world, you know, inhabited by what they call, you know, flatlanders, you know, people that are flat, all they see in their world is flat shapes like circles or squares or triangles. You know, that's all they can ever see. And that if you entered into their world as a three-dimensional creature and got, let's say, a balloon and tried to push it through their world, all they would see is a circle gradually expanding outwards to its maximum width and then retracting back down into nothing. That's all they would see. They would see a flat plan of what was going on. And they'd have to interpret what was going on based on that. They could not ever see that balloon because they only exist in a two-dimensional geometry, whereas we are three-dimensional. So we would never, ever be able to directly perceive anything on a fourth or a multi-dimensional level. And so that doesn't mean we can't interact with it, but what it does mean is that we won't totally be able to understand what's going on ever. You know, I mean, it's we know that in theory multidimensionality exists. We can even predict what the geometry of the fourth dimension looks like, but we can only ever portray it as three-dimensional geometry, which means we can't even show it the way that it should be. So if these entities, if this consciousness, if these beings, which, by the way, that the term that we use now is n-dimensional beings, n referring to number, because that's the number of dimensions. We don't know how many dimensions might be involved here. It could be 4, could be 11, could be 22, could be thousands. So we call them n-dimensional beings, or for short, n beings. And these n beings, you know, we think have been connecting with humanity since the beginning. And we need to start understanding that in many ways, they are the true ancient aliens.
And even, I think they might have, well, there's these ideas that they might have had an influence in our development, from our brains to our, perhaps even to our genetics, our bodies. So not just this chance of them having helped create the gigantic buildings and megaliths and stone circles, etc. But even to our own existence, perhaps, or to our own evolution. So maybe, what do you think in the case of the Denisovans? Well, maybe we could explain a little bit who they are, because it's, as I understand it, it's kind of like a new link that has been found, or a parallel humanoid that coexisted with other versions of us, and
Yeah.
how they could have been helped by these end beings, like you were saying.
Yeah, the ambience, yeah. Okay, well, the Denisovans, we didn't know they existed until the year 2010. Prior to this time, we know that before the rise of modern humans, let's say about 65,000 years ago, when they came out of Africa and populated the Eurasian continent, reaching as far as Australia, the only other type of archaic humans that were probably still around at that time was the Neanderthals. And they are distant cousins of ours. They split away from a common ancestor that we shared with them, several 100,000 years ago. And in other words, we were both humanoid. We both thought in similar manners, although not the same. And the Neanderthals probably had a head start on us in many respects. And they were incredibly advanced by, let's say, 60, 70,000 years ago, with everything from primitive forms of what appears to be shamanism connected with the vulture, to the earliest cave art, the earliest knowledge of possibly medicine and herbs, to the burial of the dead, to the use of different types of gum to stick together things, to many other things which I can't remember at the moment. But they were very advanced, so they may have even been more advanced than most of our ancestors at this time, who were more inclined to be territorial, in the sense that they would go into a certain area, probably exhaust it of the resources that were available, food-wise, and then move on. This is something that would have happened century after century, millennia after millennia, until gradually we populated all of the Eurasian continent. And with our rise came the demise of the Neanderthals. Nobody knows exactly why. There are hundreds of different theories on why the Neanderthals disappeared, probably about 30 to 40,000 years ago. But what we didn't know is that there was another branch of the Homo species in the central and eastern part of the Eurasian continent. And this was only discovered in 2010, when a finger bone that was discovered in the Denisova cave in Siberia, within the Altai Mountains, was sequenced by the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And it was realized that this was not Neanderthal. It was not from an anatomical modern human, that's us. It was from something else. And that something else now had to have a name. And so they called it Denisovan, after the Denisova cave. And what also became apparent is that when they looked at the genome that had been sequenced of the Denisovan, that some of the genes there had already been discovered in the genome of modern humans. And what this meant was that we had inherited some of these genes from the Denisovans. And what that meant, of course, is that we must have interbred with them. In other words, when we came across them, the two of us got together for whatever reason and however that took place. And the descendants, the hybrid descendants of those Denisovans, went on to people different parts of the ancient world. For instance, the area of Melanesia and Southeast Asia in general, the peoples there, or some of the peoples, have anything up to 5 to 6% Denisovan DNA. It's quite high in India, for instance. It's there in Siberia. It's there in amongst the originals of Australia. There's very little in Europe. It's been found to a very small degree amongst Finnish peoples, but Finnish people do have a very small amount of Asian ancestry, which is probably where the Denisovan DNA comes from. And it's recently been found in Icelanders, people from Iceland. And the reason why it's there is because these people were Norwegians that had gone over there probably about 1,000 years ago and set up. And the Norwegians that are in Norway today are not pure blood, if you like. They've mixed with various other types of human groups. So that DNA of the Denisovans was watered out, whereas with those in Iceland, it's still preserved. And what this tells us is that even though the Denisovans seem to have existed mainly in Central and Eastern Asia, and obviously Southern Asia as well, is that some of the hybrid descendants moved westwards, carrying both their Asian and their Denisovan DNA into Europe. But that most of the rest of us are simply either anatomical modern humans, and with that, a very small amount of Neanderthal DNA, because some of the genes we have also been inherited from them. Now, where am I going with all this? Well, at the Denisova cave in Siberia, the same level that they found a couple of large teeth from Denisovans, various bones, fragments, a new announcement recently about a milk tooth being found there that's now dated to about 250,000 years ago, is that at the same level that most of the Denisovan bones were being found, they also found evidence of high technology, including a beautiful bracelet, which if you look online and just type in Denisovan bracelet, you'll see what I mean. And it's this beautiful bangle, basically, that would probably have gone on an arm of a woman, made of a beautiful green stone called chloritolite. The reason it's green is because it's got chlorite in it. And it's beautifully symmetrically finished and polished, and it has a hole pierced through it that, when it was examined under a microscope, was found to have a feed rate or to have come from a drill with a very fast speed rate, almost comparable to a modern day drill. Now, this doesn't mean that they had electric drills back then. What it does mean is that they were clever enough to master the invention of drills, fast turning drills that they could use to pierce through jewelry at that time. But in addition to this, the Denisovans had the earliest bone needles, which they were obviously using to create tailored clothing. They created beautiful sculptures of animals that have got notches and marks on them that seem to have an understanding of the cycles of the sun and the moon. They may even have ridden horses. Horse DNA has been found in the cave that has led to speculation, and it is only speculation, that the Denisovans not only were taming horses, but may have been riding them. And several other firsts for them. And it's very clear that the Denisovans, particularly those of Siberia, were amongst the most advanced peoples in the world between about 70 down to their disappearance about 40,000 years ago. And that the earliest modern humans to reach this same area encountered the last of the Denisovans, if you like, and interbred with them. And the legacy of the Denisovans was passed on to us. And at that point, we created what's known as the late Paleolithic period, where everything begins to change from a creation of style of living and tools and points, that they were using spearheads or whatever, that suddenly changes into a style which we recognize as that of anatomical modern humans. But we're now beginning to realize that we didn't invent this. We inherited it from the Denisovans. They gave it to us when our first ancestors encountered them, either in Siberia or more likely just a little bit to the south and east of there in Mongolia, where some very early human settlements have been found, where the stone tool technology is quite clearly Denisovan, and then it suddenly is in layers that are those of our own modern human ancestors. And what's so interesting is that that same toolkit is then kept and used by the upper Paleolithic period, people, right the way down to the creation of Göbekli Tepe in southeast Turkey 11,000 years ago. And I am certain that the creation of Göbekli Tepe was the end product of this legacy that had been handed to us on a plate by the Denisovans as early as about 40 to 45,000 years ago. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that the carvings on the T-shaped stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe are very similar to those created by a culture, or more than one culture actually, in the Ural Mountains that border between Europe and Asia. When I say Asia, border between Europe and Siberia, and that is where we should be looking for the origin of the people at Göbekli Tepe.
Wow, yeah, it's so amazing how you're helping me get a new grasp on the, because we have this idea of Neanderthals and all this thing, this hubris of us, like thinking they are very barbaric, or but you're giving me this new visual of them having perhaps even settlements, or I wouldn't, maybe not cities, but I mean, I was just looking at the bracelet. I'm going to see if I can share the screen, and it's, here we go. Let me see. It's amazing. And even the circle that's been drilled here, one has to wonder how they could have been able to create something like that, being that we think they were so primitive. Like many times we have these ideas of like the pyramids were built with copper tools or something like that, and we fail to understand how advanced the I don't want to call them. Would you say the Denisovans were humans?
They are humans, yeah. I mean, but they're just not anatomically modern humans. I mean,
and
humans
they're advanced. That's my point.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, obviously, going back to your question earlier about how they might be linked with higher consciousness, with end beings, and things like that, is that we obviously don't know what was going on in Siberia, let's say 40 to 70,000 years ago. But the one thing that we can do is suggest that these people were entering into altered states of consciousness, and that, at this time they were linking with otherworldly environments, which would have had a world of animals, a world of the ancestors, which they would have perhaps seen as quite localized, as in their own mental approach to it, but that there could easily be intuition, insights, downloads that were coming from another source, and that we cannot say, for instance, that they may not have been seeing and interacting with strange phenomena themselves, which was quite literally triggering transformative experiences. And the other thing that we know about the Denisovans is that they have certain genes which they share with us, which are associated with autism. And autism, those on the autism spectrum, display what are known as savant qualities. And these savant qualities can include anything from being able to paint beautifully without any kind of education, be able to play pieces of music without any kind of instruction, and obviously calendar count is the you know, the most obvious thing that if you say to an autistic person, tell me, you know, what day of the week, you know, September the 23rd, 2052 is, they will be able to tell you. And I mean, this is no game, this is no gimmick. I mean, for them, it's something that just comes into their head. And there was there was autistic twins that were able to calculate days of a week 10,000 years into the future and 10,000 years into the past. Now, God knows how they did the past, because obviously we've had quite a few date changes, you know, calendar changes along the way, but apparently they were able to do that. Now, okay, this is in the modern day, and we see this as some kind of, you know, gimmick, if you like, something that allows that, you know, autistic people to interact with us in a sort of humorous manner. But this is a deadly serious thing, and I think that if it has been with autistic people, it's been there all the way along since the time of the Denisovans, and it probably was the thing that first made them start looking at the cycles of the sun and the moon, counting them, noting where the sun and the moon rise. And this would eventually have led to an understanding of things like eclipse cycles, and then using those eclipse cycles to predict dates in the future, not just a few decades into the future, but hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of years into the future, and giving us key so-called cosmic numbers that we find again and again in mythologies around the world, in architecture around the world, particularly sacred architecture, in king lists, in dimensions and shapes. You know, there are certain numbers that keep cropping up, like 432, 108, 54, 72. And all of these very strongly are derived from an understanding of the movement and synchronization of the cycles of the sun and the moon.
And do we have any glimpse or any idea of the, you mentioned shamanism, of the spirituality of the Denisovans?
Not yet. No, in all honesty. I mean, other than just a few artifacts that suggest that it's present, there's more evidence connecting shamanism with the Neanderthals, but simply because we've obviously been finding artifacts in association with the Neanderthals the last, you know, 150 odd years, whereas those of the Denisovans are coming from one location, and that's the Denisova cave. I mean, they've also found a jaw of a Denisovan in Tibet that's about 160,000 years old, which is on, yeah, which comes from the Tibetan plateau. And what's so interesting about that is that the old, you know, sacred texts of the Tibetans talk about a time before our own ancestors occupied this region. And it said that the area was under the control of giants and ogres. You know, quite human. They had their own, you know, dynasties and things like this, but, you know, they were there before us. And the evidence to date seems to suggest that the Denisovans were not just extremely robust and of large size, but may, and I say may, have been of extraordinary height as well. I mean, for instance, one of well, two of the molar teeth that were found, which date to, I'm going to say, about 50,000 years ago, are twice the size of those of a anatomical modern human. And although some people out there will say to you, oh, well, there's no relationship between the size of teeth and height, that's actually wrong. You know, my colleague Greg Little has found good evidence to show that the size of teeth can very easily relate to height and girth of a person, you know, as far as their frame is concerned. So, you know, there is a chance that they were very big guys, basically. And if that's so, then a lot of legends around the world relating to giants could actually be abstract memories of the Denisovans and or their hybrid descendants. And I mean, we're talking here also about the Americas, of course, where a large number, thousands of giant bones have been found in Native American mounds, in cemeteries across the continent. Many of these are quite recent. When I say recent, I mean in compared with the Denisovans, maybe a couple of thousand years old. Some of them may be as much as 7,000 years old, but they're relatively recent. But what this suggests is that the hybrids of the Denisovans, and possibly, mixed in with the Neanderthals as well, is that they reached the Americas possibly as much as 30,000 years ago, arguably even earlier, and inhabited North America. And that a lot of the legends of giants, particularly from Native American tradition, are some kind of abstract memory of the hybrids, the final hybrid descendants of those Denisovans.
I was just about to go there to ask about the possibility of a Denisovan influence in America. So that's very interesting, because I find it so interesting that racially, natives from for example Peru, they have such a similar appearance to people in Tibet, and yet they are in such distant places. And I think all these discoveries might be shaping the way that we think about this idea of humanity, like originating in one place and moving. But now we are seeing like very different tribes or races of humans who of course moved, but intermingled with people in different places, and so we can find and even cultural things and language things that are similar in regions that are so distant from each other. And I was thinking about this tooth that you mentioned, this guy could have like a giant head and a small body maybe, but no, I think it's totally reasonable that there's proportions in bodies.
Yeah,
so definitely. But do you think that would mean Denisovans could have been like twice as tall as
I mean, I think we're talking. I mean, if you can imagine the biggest wrestler in the WWE, that's what we're talking about here.
Right.
Very robust, quite tall, probably 7 to 7.5 feet tall. And the person that comes to mind is a wrestler called the Great Khali. I think he was born in northern India. And just look at him. I think he's 7 feet tall in height. His girth is huge. I mean, and when there's somebody of normal size next to him, they look up to him. And to me, that's the relationship between anatomical modern humans and Denisovans. Now, let's get this straight. I'm pretty certain that not all Denisovans were this type of height. I think that some were. And we don't know whether the Denisovans were this size all the way along. I mean, I think that they probably weren't. I mean, the milk tooth that was found recently, that's 250,000 years ago, that comes from the Denisova cave, is fairly normal size. Now, that means it's either belongs to, a child, maybe, if you're talking about giants, or that back then, the Denisovans were not as big as they eventually ended up being. Now, it may have been through necessity in harsh environments that they ended up becoming much larger in size. Obviously, like animals in isolated islands and things like this end up becoming much bigger if they're left to their own devices. But there is a connection between the Denisovans and what we are talking about and what I'm writing about in the next book, because I've already written one article for Ancient Origins website suggesting that the Denisovans, as they came out of Africa, possibly as early as 400 to 500,000 years ago, they passed through the Levant. And in the Levant at this time were some of the most advanced people in the world. And the main place of focus of this culture right now is a place called the Kezem Cave in Israel. And this is where shamanism was born 400,000 years ago. It seems as if the people there may well have been using the swan as their totem. And I've written much about the swan as a totem of shamanism in various of my books. How important it is as a soul bird and as a symbol of the formation of the human from the physical into the afterlife or the sky world. This was one of the main birds that was used for that. And it would seem that this was the first totem that we have that was used by our forerunners. And these people in the Kezem Cave were advancing so quickly. I mean that they invented everything from the first freeze-dried food to the first canned food, to some of the most advanced stone tools, which end up, being created by the Denisovans, or recreated, I should say, as part of a cyclic motion. They were using caves for spatial reasons. They created what's known as a school of rock, which is basically, teacher, pupil, whole thing. I mean, there's so much to do with them. It's just difficult to even go into how many advances. And the way that they were acting was very similar to anatomical modern humans. And the teeth that have been found in the cave are more or less identical with our own. And this is anything up to 400,000 years ago.
What is the name of these people?
Well, they only have one of these, long-winded archaeological names. They are the Acheulean Yabrudian cultural complex, the AYCC. But I just call them the Kezem people. The Kezem people, existed at this cave and at various other sites in what is today Israel and in Syria from around 420,000 years ago down to about 200,000 years ago. And at that point, right at the end of their time in the Levant, which is what the whole of that region is called, the area was essentially taken over by Neanderthals, although there was a branch of proto-modern humans who continued on, and there's a lot of evidence of their remains have been found dating to around 100,000 years ago in that region. I mean, I was out in Israel and in the West Bank last December, looking at the various sites involved in this, which will all be coming out in the new book, and how all of this happened, and how we can virtually take the ancient alien story, if you like, to Israel 400,000 years ago and try and understand what was going on in the heads of these people. It's so easy just to say, oh, they were contacted by aliens, but you have to have absolute evidence that something different was going on back then. And as I've tried to say throughout the whole of this talk, is that, the idea of ancient aliens is not something that only happened a couple of thousand years ago or 500 years ago. If ancient aliens have been around with us, or ancient N beings, let's call them, we're talking about going back 400,000 years ago, and arguably even earlier still. But that's future research that even I have yet to do.
This is all blowing my mind. Like I'm starting to form this picture that is comparable to, I don't know if you're aware of the Theosophical Society and kind of their ideas of very much advanced but also very ancient civilizations of humanity, perhaps even connected to this idea of Atlantis and Lemuria and all these mythological or who knows what they were places. And I'm starting to get this idea of this new perspective of of Neanderthals and Denisovans and these other AYCC people, and yeah, it's so much to like create a new vision of our past. Like we tend to think so what would you call it, like anthropomorphic and anthropocentrically. Like we tend to look at ourselves and project ourselves back, but there's been so much change and so much intermingling between different lines of genetics, perhaps, getting together and forming what we know today as humans. But in a way, like something must have happened along the way that caused certain branches of this tree to perhaps be extinct, or to have to go into hiding, or even perhaps the different races of humanity from nowadays have, like you were saying perhaps earlier, more percentage of one of the branches, or more percentage of another, something like that, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned the A word, Atlantis. And I think that, and a lot of people are going to hate me for saying what I'm about to say, but I think that looking at the advanced technologies of Göbekli Tepe and those of, let's say, the Great Pyramid and the Pyramid Age, and suggesting that they do come from Atlantis, they are a remnant or a legacy of Atlantis, I think is unnecessary anymore. I mean, to start off with, the Great Pyramid is 7,000 years after Göbekli Tepe. So that means that these people who I show in my book, The Cygnus Key, were in Göbekli Tepe and came all the way down through the Levant and end up in Egypt with exactly the same culture in 8,000 or 9,000 BC, that they then flower and eventually become the pyramid builders. I mean, you can see it. The pattern is there. The stone tools leave a paper trail that you can see. So, in other words, the people that made the Great Pyramid came originally from Göbekli Tepe. The people from Göbekli Tepe came originally from Siberia and the area of the Denisova Cave. And the people at the Denisova Cave came originally from the area of the Levant. And, you know, so going all the way back to the AYCC, the Kazem people, as I call them, you know, there you can see genetic links. In fact, the new discoveries that have been made of the Denisovans just recently to do with the milk tooth and the other bones is supporting the idea that when the Denisovans passed through the Levant, probably about 4,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago, they encountered the Kazem people. The two interbred, but the Denisovans carried on into the area of Siberia and the Tibetan Plateau, taking with them the legacy of the AYCC. In other words, what ends up coming back to Göbekli Tepe and going through the Levant, it's almost like going home. And although, you know, to get, you know, too much into the idea that there is birthplaces of civilization, I think is you know, can be fraught with problems. I think that you can look at certain places and you can see where all of these things begin, whether it be the Kazem Cave, the Denisova Cave, Göbekli Tepe, the Great Pyramid. They're all linked. They're all part of a bigger picture. We don't need Atlantis. Atlantis was created by Plato, a philosopher, 350 BC, based on stories and legends that were reaching him from across the Atlantic, probably in the area of the Bahamas and the Caribbean, about the high cultures and peoples that were probably there, and beyond that, in the Gulf of Mexico, you know, maybe the Olmecs and people like that. And he had certain dates. He was correct about the fact that there was a cataclysm around the time frame that he says that Atlantis was destroyed. And that's it. yeah, they were dialogues. People have picked up this story from Atlantis, from Plato, and run with it. And I don't think you need that. And I mean, if people want to write their books saying, oh, you know, civilization comes from Atlantis, let them. That's absolutely fine. Let them, because what I think I'm doing is finding some of the true points of genesis of civilization. And, you know, to me, I think that's much more valuable in trying to put all this into some kind of historical scientific perspective.
And you know what? I think there's also this point about language and about defining things. And many people talk about Atlantis, but I don't know if there is like this one definition. There are different ways of talking about this civilization that came before. And there's a cataclysm. They destroy themselves or something like that, and then they travel and spread all over the world. But some people say, oh, this civilization of Atlantis was in this place in the map. Other people say it was here, it was over there, over there. So there's still a question of whether there was this one Atlantis or there's many different things. And perhaps what you're explaining could help give some more context by tracing the way the way civilization moved and the way these different genes moved all over the place.
Yes, definitely. I mean, the idea of some kind of mother civilization under the name of Atlantis being the root of other much later civilizations on both sides of the Atlantic comes from Ignatius Donnelly, the US congressman who wrote a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, that was published in, I'm going to say, 1882. The book was a bestseller around the world, still sells today. And you know, it was a great theory, a great idea. But his Atlantis was in the middle of the Atlantic, where the Azores and the Atlantic Rift is, and it doesn't really work today. We know a lot more about, you know, the continental drifts and why there are certain types of animals and plants on one side of the Atlantic which are on the same as the other. And you know, I think that in many ways Atlantis is a place of the heart. It's a place that we believe we want to connect with. We almost see it as the point of origin of humanity, and that we are all in some way, you know, descendant of Atlanteans. And I think that that's where it has to stay. The idea that we come from Atlantis has to stay in the heart. By all means, find the archaeological evidence for it. But that archaeological evidence so far is based on pet theories, personal theories. And that's fine. I mean, if somebody wants to place Atlantis in Antarctica, another wants to place it in West Africa, and another wants to place it in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, that's fine. You know, these are theories. We have not found any underwater ruins, except off of places like Cuba, where we've actually got anything that says, has a sign that says welcome to Atlantis. There's just nothing like that, and you never will. It just won't exist. That's not to say that there were not antediluvian, i.e. pre-flood civilizations. There probably were in parts of the world, maybe off the coast of India, perhaps, as I said, in the Caribbeans, the Bahamas and the Caribbeans, maybe in Indonesia, maybe Easter Island. We don't know. You know, I mean, all of these are possibilities, and there's certainly archaeology in the waters that could go back, as Graham Hancock has written in one of his books, that predates 10,000 BC. There's no problem with that. But I think that these are themselves offshoots or branches of a much more primary strata of humanity that begins with the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, and our own forebears, you know, like those in Israel, the Khazem people.
And so, in all these years of investigation, have you felt like have you found some closure to that experience you were relating earlier at the start of this family contacting this other consciousness? Have you understood that a bit more in all of this
Yeah,
research?
I have. Yeah, because they had a classic abduction, but they didn't look at it in the same way as a classic abductee would do. Because what was quite clear is that when they entered into this luminous bank of green mist, two of the children of the three were asleep in the back seat. The third one, who was probably coming about, let's say 10, had his arms up on the front two seats, the passenger and the driver's seat. And when they went into this mist, they felt nauseous. They suddenly lost, any perspective of reality, and suddenly find themselves coming out 3/4 of a mile further on. Now, when they came out, everybody was in exactly the same places. The child still has his hands on the seats in front of him. The other two children were asleep in the back. And when I heard this, and when I heard that the family, knew that something real had happened. I mean, and there's no question about it. I'm still in touch with John Day to this day, and he's a great man. I believe every word he says. But even he says something else was going on here, something much deeper. And what I realized is that when they entered that mist, they didn't just lose 3 hours of their life by spending it on board some spacecraft. They lost that time instantaneously. In other words, they were thrust not just through space, a distance of 3/4 of a mile, but they were thrust through time 3 hours. That time was lost instantaneously. But somehow, in that moment, allowed them to connect with this other consciousness, with this other intelligence that was able to communicate a whole load of things to them. Yes, they saw it in terms of a classic inside of a spaceship, but it could have been anything. It could have been the inside of a diner in Miami. I mean, it could have been anything, because that's what we expect to see. If we have an abduction, we expect now to find ourselves inside a nuts and bolts spacecraft with buttons and screens which will be shown to you, and medical tables and stuff like that. That's what we expect to happen. But several hundred years ago, exactly the same type of abduction was occurring, and we were taken into a house of, where fairies were dancing. Or we were taken to heaven, where we encountered God and Jesus and the Virgin Mary. Or for those that, thought differently, they ended up in hell, being tortured by demons or something. It's whatever cultural perspectives that we have. Once that communion, that connection takes place, is what will happen to us. And as I said, I'm not saying 100% therefore that nuts and bolts spacecraft are not coming to this world. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that a large amount of what we experience is more to do with multidimensionality than it is nuts and bolts spacecraft coming from another planet and just turning up here.
Yeah, that's a very mature way of looking at it, trying to not jump to conclusions of things that really we are just just starting to understand a little bit more in this new age. And Andrew, thank you so much for your time. This has been, as I was saying before, a very enlightening conversation. It gave me a lot to think about our ancient past and the all that we've traveled and all that we've interbred in the past to become who humanity is today, and how much we owe to this n-dimensional presence that like you, I also have had certain experiences that have proven to me that there is something else. So I want to thank you so much for your time, for your disposition to be here. And please go ahead and let the audience know where they can find you, where they can find your books.
Okay, well, I mean, just go on to Amazon or Barnes and Noble, and you know, check out some of my books. Denisovan Origins is the current one. Light Quest, I think you'll love. That came out in 2012. And I mean, obviously, I'm on Ancient Aliens, Unexplained with William Shatner, Gaia TV, Ancient Civilizations, and their other show, Deep Space. But beyond that, I mean, you know, I mean, as I said, the book I'm writing at the moment is going to put everything that I've written before into a nutshell and take it on to the ultimate limit, basically. But that's certainly until the book after that, and then we'll take it even further. So I'll see you out and about. I mean, I'm at a couple of events next year if they're allowed to go on. One is the Contact in the Desert. I'm there. Come and see us there and say hi. And New Living Expo in San Mateo in the Bay Area, California, next April as well. So watch out for all of those and keep safe.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much. I'll be looking forward for that new book to get a very beautiful glimpse of what you've uncovered so far in a nutshell. I love that. And well, I would really love to have you back again to continue exploring all of this.
Excellent. Thank you. And we will do that, definitely.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rafa.